He thought changing the locks would be enough. He had no idea the locks were never what stood between him and what he wanted. My uncle Gerald didn't come to my father's funeral out of grief. I knew that the moment I saw him scanning the room instead of looking at the casket. His eyes moved the way someone's eyes move when they're calculating, not mourning. My father, David, passed on a Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer. He was 58 years old, and he handled his dying the same way he handled everything else in his life. Quietly, deliberately, and without a single loose end. He was a civil engineer who had spent 30 years building things that were meant to last. Bridges, drainage systems, foundations. He believed that the structure beneath everything was the only thing that mattered. The surface, he always said, is just what people see. I am my father's daughter in every way that counts. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. My job, in the simplest terms, is to find what people try to hide. I follow money the way a tracker follows footprints through the mud, through the redirections, through the places where the trail seems to disappear but never actually does. I'm good at it. My father made sure I would be. He started teaching me when I was 12, not accounting specifically, just patterns. How to read a room, how to notice what someone doesn't say, how to keep records of things that seem unimportant, because the unimportant things are exactly what people stop watching. I thought for a long time that he was just being thorough, the way engineers are thorough. Now I understand he was preparing me for Gerald. My uncle is my father's younger brother. He's 53, divorced twice, and has lived for the past decade in Phoenix, on what he describes as investments. Though I've never been able to identify what those investments actually are. He and my father were not close. There was a falling out years before I was born, something involving money, something involving my grandfather's estate, and the two of them settled into a cold, functional politeness that lasted until my father got sick. When my father's diagnosis came, Gerald called for the first time in 4 years. He said he wanted to reconnect. He said family was family. My father listened, thanked him, and then called me afterward and said 3 words. He knows something. I asked what he meant. My father said that Gerald had always had a sense for when the tide was about to turn, that he had shown up at their father's bedside with the same gentleness, the same concern, the same carefully rehearsed warmth, and that 2 weeks after their father died, Gerald had produced a handwritten addendum to the will that no one had seen before, and that conveniently redirected a significant portion of the estate toward himself. The addendum was eventually thrown out, but it had cost my father 18 months of legal fees and a relationship with his mother that never fully recovered. My father did not intend for history to repeat itself. Over the following 8 months, while he was still well enough to sit at his desk, he worked with his attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had handled his professional contracts for 20 years, to structure everything with a precision that left no gaps. The house, which he owned outright, went into a revocable living trust with me as successor trustee. His investment accounts had beneficiary designations updated and notarized. His business assets, he had a small consulting practice he'd wound down after his diagnosis, were formally dissolved with documentation filed in 2 separate county offices. Patricia held the originals of everything. Certified copies went to a fireproof safe in her office. And 1 additional set, sealed in a manila envelope, went to my apartment in Columbus with specific instructions about when to open it. He didn't explain the envelope when he gave it to me. He just said, "You'll know when." I knew when Gerald walked into the reception after the funeral and asked my mother, within 40 minutes of arriving, whether my father had left a will. My mother's name is Susan. She's 56, soft-spoken, and has spent most of her adult life deferring to the people around her, not from weakness, but from a genuine belief that conflict is almost never worth the cost. She loved my father deeply, and was devastated by his death in the way that people are devastated when they lose not just a person, but an entire architecture of daily life. She didn't know how to pay the quarterly taxes. She had never refinanced a mortgage. She trusted people who presented themselves as competent, because competence was something she genuinely admired and did not always feel she possessed. Gerald understood this immediately. He didn't ask aggressive questions. He asked helpful ones. Was she managing all right with the paperwork? Did she understand the process for transferring the utilities? Had anyone walked her through what happens to a jointly held account when one spouse passes? He framed everything as concern. He brought grocery bags when he visited. He fixed a leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. He referred to my father's passing as a transition, and to the estate as what David built for your future. He stayed for 3 days after the funeral. Then he extended it to a week. Then he mentioned, casually, that his lease in Phoenix was month to month, and that he could stay longer if my mother needed help settling things. I drove up from Columbus on day 6. I want to be clear about something. I didn't go to confront him. I went to observe. There is a significant difference, and it matters. Confrontation without evidence is just noise. I had been trained by my work and by my father to collect before I acted. So I sat at the kitchen table and I watched, and I listened. And I took notes on my phone the way I take notes at the beginning of every financial investigation. Dates, times, exact phrasing, context. What I noticed was that Gerald never asked me anything directly. He asked around me. He would address questions to my mother that were clearly meant to establish what I knew and how much access I had. He asked whether I was handling the financial side of things or whether my mother had her own advisor. He asked whether my father had kept everything in order or whether there would be some untangling to do. He said, twice, that he hoped my father hadn't overcomplicated things the way David sometimes did. The second time he said it, my mother laughed softly and said, "He was very thorough." And Gerald smiled and said, "That's one word for it." I wrote that down. On day 8, Gerald asked my mother whether she'd had a chance to look through my father's home office. He said he wanted to make sure nothing important got overlooked. He said he'd been thinking about my grandfather's estate and how much easier it would have been if someone had helped organize early on. My mother said she hadn't gone through the office yet, that she wasn't ready. Gerald said he understood completely. He said he was just offering. That evening, after Gerald had gone to the guest room, I sat with my mother at the kitchen table and I asked her, as gently as I could, how she was feeling about having him there. She said she appreciated the company. She said it was hard to be alone in the house. She said Gerald had been very kind. I said, "Has he asked you about the house?" She paused. Then she said he had mentioned, once, that it was a lot of space for one person and that there were tax benefits to certain property arrangements. I nodded. I didn't say anything else that night. The next morning I called Patricia Holt from my car in the driveway. I told her what I'd observed. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Your father thought this might happen." She told me that the trust documents were structured specifically to prevent any transfer or encumbrance of the property without my signature as trustee. She said that even if my mother wanted to add someone to the deed or enter into a financial agreement involving the house, she legally could not do so without my written approval. She said the accounts were similarly protected. She said, "There is nothing Gerald can access, Claire, but that doesn't mean he won't try to find a way around it." I went back inside. I made coffee. I waited. Gerald stayed for another 2 weeks. During that time, he asked my mother to sign 2 documents. The first was a form he described as a reimbursement agreement for expenses he'd incurred traveling to the funeral. It was typed on plain paper with no letterhead and contained language in the 3rd paragraph that I recognized immediately. It was a partial power of attorney template, modified to look like something else. The second was what he called a family financial summary that he said would help him help her understand what she had. It was a data collection form. It asked for account numbers, institution names, and estimated balances. My mother hadn't signed either one. She'd told him she wanted to look them over first. I photographed both documents. I sent them to Patricia. She called me within the hour and said the first one was concerning enough that we should document it formally and that she was adding it to the file she was building. I asked what file. She said my father had asked her to keep one, starting from the first phone call Gerald made after the diagnosis. She said my father had been very specific. He wanted a record, and he wanted it maintained by someone with professional obligation and legal standing. She said the file was substantial. I sat in my car for a long time after that phone call. I thought about my father sitting at his desk in the months before he died, already too tired to work but not yet too tired to plan. I thought about him on the phone with Patricia, methodically building a case against a threat that hadn't fully materialized yet. I thought about the envelope in my apartment, still sealed. I went home to Columbus that weekend and I opened it. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting, dated 7 months before he died. It was 4 pages. It documented, in his precise engineer's shorthand, Everything he had observed about Gerald over the course of his lifetime, the pattern of behavior around their father's estate, 2 other incidents involving family money that I hadn't known about, and a specific concern that Gerald would attempt to insert himself into my mother's life after his death. He named tactics he expected Gerald to use. He said he had already taken steps to ensure those tactics would fail. He listed Patricia's name, the trust structure, the account protections, and the name of a family law attorney in Cleveland he had already retained on a contingency basis. At the bottom of the last page, he had written, "You won't need to fight loudly, Claire. Everything is already in place. All you need to do is hold the line." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then, I made a spreadsheet. Over the following 6 weeks, I documented every interaction Gerald had with my mother that I was aware of through my mother's own accounts, through texts she forwarded me, and through 2 weekends I spent in town observing directly. I organized everything chronologically: date, nature of interaction, any documents or requests involved, my mother's response, and my assessment of intent. I cross-referenced it against the file Patricia had been maintaining. I sent Patricia a copy of my father's letter. She called me after she read it and said, "He was a remarkable man." I said, "I knew." I want to pause here, because I think people sometimes assume that what I was doing was cold, that I was treating my father's death like a case file and my mother like a protected asset and my uncle like a subject under investigation. And I understand why it might look that way from the outside. But here's what was actually happening. I was scared. I was scared in the specific way you're scared when you love someone who doesn't see the thing that's coming toward them. My mother is not naive. She's not foolish, but she was grieving. And grief does something to the part of your brain that assesses risk. It makes people want to believe in kindness because kindness is what they need. Gerald was providing a simulation of kindness, and my mother needed the real thing badly enough that she wasn't examining the simulation closely. I couldn't tell her what I suspected without evidence, because she would defend him. Not because she trusted him, but because confronting him would have meant confronting the possibility that her husband's brother had shown up at her door with a plan instead of a heart. That was too much grief to carry at once. So I held the line, quietly. The way my father asked me to. Gerald left at the end of week 6. He said he had things to take care of in Phoenix. He said he'd be back in the spring. He hugged my mother at the door and told her to call if she needed anything. 3 days later, he called Patricia's office and asked to review my father's estate documents. He identified himself as a family member with an interest in the estate and suggested that, as my father's only surviving sibling, he may have standing to contest certain elements of the trust. Patricia told him she represented the estate and the trustee, not him, and that any legal claims would need to be filed formally through the appropriate channels. She said she would be documenting the call. He said that seemed unnecessarily adversarial for a family matter. She said she would still be documenting it. He filed a formal challenge 6 weeks later through an attorney in Phoenix. The claim was that the trust had been created under conditions of undue influence, specifically, that I had influenced my father's decisions during his illness in ways that unfairly disadvantaged other family members. I had been waiting for that exact argument. Patricia and I had discussed it months earlier, because my father had discussed it in his letter. He had anticipated that Gerald would challenge on undue influence grounds, and he had structured the documentation accordingly. Every meeting with Patricia had been recorded with Gerald's potential challenge in mind. My father had provided a sworn statement, prepared while he was still legally competent and witnessed by 2 independent parties, affirming that he had made his decisions freely, without pressure, and with full understanding of their implications. The statement included a specific paragraph addressing Gerald by name and explaining, plainly, why he had been excluded from any interest in the estate. My father had written it himself, in his own words, in the voice of someone who had been watching his brother for 50 years and had run out of patience for pretending otherwise. The challenge was dismissed at the preliminary hearing. The judge noted that the documentation in support of the trust was among the most thorough she had reviewed in her time on the bench. I found out in a phone call from Patricia on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk eating lunch. She told me the ruling and I said thank you, and we talked for a few more minutes about some remaining administrative items. After I hung up, I sat for a while and thought about my father. I thought about the bridge he'd designed early in his career, the one he drove me past every time we went to see my grandmother. He always pointed it out. Not proudly, just factually. I built that one, he'd say. It'll be there after both of us are gone. He cared deeply about things that outlasted him. I called my mother that evening. I told her the challenge had been dismissed. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Your father knew, didn't he? He knew this would happen." I said, "Yes. He planned for it." She was quiet again. Then she said, "He always planned for the things he hoped wouldn't happen." I said, "I know, Mom." We talked for another hour about other things. About the garden she wanted to plant in the spring. About a trip she was thinking about taking. About a neighbor who had brought her soup twice that week, unprompted, for no reason except that she was kind. The house felt different on my next visit. Not lighter, exactly. Just settled, like something that had been held in tension had finally been allowed to rest. I keep my father's letter in the fireproof safe in my apartment now, along with copies of everything else. Not because I think I'll need them. Because some things are worth keeping, not for use, but for record. Evidence that something happened exactly the way it happened, and that someone was paying attention. Gerald hasn't called my mother since the ruling. He hasn't called me either. I didn't expect an apology. I don't need one. The structure held. That was the point. My father built things that were meant to last. So did I.